I'm Shane Hamilton. I'm a reader in Strategy Management Society at the University of York.
And I'm Andrew Godley. I'm Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Sussex. Back in 2010, I was working on a project that was trying to look at the relationship between the development of the British poultry industry and British supermarkets, where there was this really tight relationship between supermarkets that were interested in developing this new product, the frozen chicken, and to use that to promote this new format, the supermarket format. But the problem was that they didn't have any chickens. And so they had to create this new industry working with the poultry farmers to create this new product. And that was a really interesting project. And I got to interview several of the people who'd been these key innovators, key poultry producers that were very entrepreneurial and had worked really, really carefully, really closely with the leading supermarkets. And one of them was just really funny. He was just always telling lots of jokes. But there was this one joke that he told about this time when Sainsbury's, so at the time the biggest supermarket in the country, the senior director for poultry, board director, came to visit this new processing plant just outside Edinburgh. And he slipped and he put his foot, his shoe, into the drain where all the gizzards and the rubbish that came out of the processing plant was collecting. And his response in the interview was just guffaws of laughter. He thought this was so funny. And of course, in an interview setting, you just respond, you just laugh with laughter. You just think, well, that's really funny as well. But years later, when Shane and I were just talking about this particular project, what became this paper, I just thought, why was that so funny? It was an appalling thing. Why was he laughing so much at this partner, this other person he was working with, who'd given them so many opportunities? Why was it so funny that he told this joke to us and he was laughing so much to us? But also we heard it through other people, other people that we interviewed, that he told this joke many times. It was like this anecdote that had gone around the industry that this senior director from Sainsbury's had put his foot and got messy with all of the chicken. So that was the anecdote, that was the story, that's the joke.
And then much of what the article does is, like Robert Darnton's classic work, The Great Cat Massacre, use historical contextualization to make sense of why something that is funny to some people, but clearly not to kind of a broader audience, why would that be funny? So Robert Darnton classically looked at this, around the period of the French Revolution, this group of French journeyman printers who killed a bunch of cats and detailed it in great detail, thought this was just hilarious. So from our perspective in modern times, of course, why would that be funny? It sounds macabre at best. But Darnton then goes on several hundred pages explaining the whole, economic, social context that would make that particular episode funny at the time. In our case, we're using this to highlight an issue of paradox in the poultry industry, agri-food standards more broadly. That basically, as paradox studies has shown, jokes are a very common way for organizational actors to try to make sense of very uncomfortable situations. That making light of a kind of imbalance of power, which is what is represented in this particular instance, helps them to kind of manage the situation that they're in, that they're being asked to make choices, but they don't have the power to actually make choices. So jokes are a way of managing that challenge. Paradox studies, it's a major kind of subfield within organization studies and management that looks at paradoxes. So paradoxes are defined theoretically as more than just tensions. So we can think of tensions as, something between, being more empowered and less empowered, right? That might be just a tension. But a paradox is when those two go together and basically can't be unraveled. So a very classic one in organization studies is between stability and change. That for a company to have stability over the long term, to be profitable, it has to be incessantly changing. And the two are so intertwined that they actually can't really come apart. It's not just a kind of either or. There's a kind of, one of the classic formulations of it is a dynamic equilibrium. That there comes a point where all the members of the organization just have to learn to kind of walk a tightrope, as it were, enabling both sides of the paradox to continue in a productive way. But some of the more recent research in the field has really highlighted how, yes, there might be dynamic equilibrium, but there might also be structural imbalances of power. Are there situations where organizational actors really don't have the power to make the changes that they're being asked to? And so much of our article dwells on that central kind of theoretical debate that's very live in paradox studies, but does so through a historical method in ways that has been repeatedly called for. Paradox studies scholars routinely say, they've been saying for some 15 years at least, we need more historical longitudinal work. And there just hasn't been much up to this point. So we're contributing to that effort.
One of the things that's, again, coming back to the case study, coming back to this relationship between these poultry industry entrepreneurs and the supermarkets. We know in the context of the UK over the last 3-4 decades, there's been this growing controversy about the power that supermarkets have over their supply chain. Now, this has been a controversy that has led to a whole host of official inquiries into whether supermarkets are abusing their market dominance, and it never goes away. But from our perspective, and from the perspective more of economics than paradox studies now, traditional approach to trying to understand this relationship between the poultry industry and the supermarket, the difficult thing to understand is why would those poultry industry entrepreneurs give so much power to the supermarket retailers at points in time when it was not obvious? It was not obvious that the supermarkets were going to become these giant, dominant monopoly players. Why did they do that? Why were they, to some extent, cooperating with this, giving more and more agency to the supermarkets and not fighting their corner? And so that was what we were trying to use paradox theory and paradox studies to try and unpack from the empirical side.
Agri-food standards, I mean, in some ways they have always existed, but in many ways they'd be more kind of implicit. There'd be agreements made in a market transaction between, say, a producer of a particular foodstuff, say, I don't know, onions, and whoever's going to buy it. There'd be expectations for what the quality, the safety of that product should be. But prior to about the mid-19th century, a lot of that is based in kind of community, interactions, face-to-face interactions that occur in a physical marketplace. With industrialization of food, you get the massive distancing, right, between producers and consumers of food. So there's an increasing push to create more formal standards, kind of not necessarily contractual, but written, formal expectations of what, I've chosen onions now as for whatever reason, what a particular onion should look like and at what price that should be sold. And so in its original formulations in the late 19th century, this enables much smoother market transactions across vast distances, enables mass distribution of food, and increases a sense, particularly for producers. It's really from the kind of business side of things, not really thinking so much about consumers per se, end consumers. How do we mitigate risk in transactions in the food marketplace? There's a pretty big shift around the 1930s when consumers become more organized and actually turn to more powerful governments, saying, actually, we want more formal intervention here. We want to have more attention to food safety and quality on the end consumer's terms. So we kind of periodize, there's first more kind of producer-oriented efforts to smooth market transactions. Then in the mid-20th century, there's an effort more consumer-driven towards food safety, food quality. But then there's a big shift in the later 20th century, around the 1980s, generally it's how it's periodized, of more business-led, so very large-scale businesses, including the supermarkets that we both study, that begin implementing their own private voluntary standards. And then from there on out, up to our day now, we have a whole ream of often global standards. So one major organization here is Global GAP, which promulgates standards from labor conditions in food packing warehouses to good agricultural practices, hazard mitigation, food safety, food quality, socio-ecological standards. They cover a wide range of issues, all of which are premised on assuring consumer trust in the food system writ large, but almost always are completely invisible to actual end consumers. Most end consumers are not aware, have never heard of global gap, even though it's omnipresent in the food system.
Well, global gap came through the efforts of the British supermarkets, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Marks and Spencer to a lesser extent, in the 1980s to try and codify their arrangements that they developed over the 1970s and 1980s with their suppliers and put together an arrangement across Europe. So the British retailers at the time were sourcing more and more of their products from across Europe, and they wanted to have, as Shane was just describing, these more standard procedures and standard products that they could be reliable for putting onto their shelves straight away.
It might be useful to point out what the GAP stands for: Good Agricultural Practices. So these standards are about how the foods are actually produced.
Yeah. So the leading British supermarkets then worked with the leading European food retailers and established what was then called Eurogap.
Europe GAP.
Europe Gap. So that was the initiator.